So next speaker is Dr. Tom Wilsma. Tom has provided science-based support to industry organizations advancing nutrient stewardship for over 30 years. He has contributed to scientific papers relating crop nutrition to health functional foods, greenhouse gas emissions, air quality, and eutrophication in Lake Erie. Tom received his PhD in soil science from Cornell University and his MSc in crop science from the University of Guelph. He has been recognized as a fellow by the American Society of Agronomy, the Soil Science Society of America, and the Canadian Society of Agronomy. Please welcome Tom.
Thank you very much, Amir, for the introduction, and I want to thank you, Amir, and the organizing committee for the invitation and the opportunity to speak to you here today. As you'll see, my topic here is enhancing your fertilizer efficiency. If you've been here for John Hurd's talk, I cannot compete with John in terms of advice on how to enhance your fertilizer efficiency, because he's certainly somebody who has worked with it, has had his boots on the ground here for much of his career. My career has been a lot more academic. I've learned a fair bit about Manitoba over the years, and I've learned a lot about how things are perceived internationally as well. What I hope to do with you today is two things. One is perhaps give you some deeper understanding of the different ways we can look at fertilizer efficiency and nutrient use efficiency as well. And secondly, how enhancing your fertilizer efficiency not only builds your return on investment and builds your profitability, which is very fundamental and important, but it also can contribute to getting a better recognition for the benefits that our responsible management in agriculture is providing to the rest of society. So, as an outline, I'm going to look a little bit at these 4 points. Responsible plant nutrition is one part of it, and for our nutrient stewardship, how that all fits together. I've had the privilege of being able to participate for the last few years in the scientific panel on responsible plant nutrition, working with scientists who are recognized from around the world, Australia, Europe, Africa, and China, and many other places as well. And then I'm going to talk about how different forms of nutrient use efficiency lend themselves to advancing the 5 different aims that we have prescribed for responsible plant nutrition. And then talk a little bit about enhanced efficiency fertilizers and their modes of action, and then gaining recognition for the value of the 4R practices that you put in place in your fields. With responsible plant nutrition, we defined 5 different aims and 6 actions. This is a group of scientists who are renowned in plant nutrition, like Hakeem Doberman, Patrick Brown, and others. And we looked at the traditional aim, is right in the center there on the right-hand side. The income, productivity, efficiency, and resilience of farms has always been the focus of plant nutrition. But today, we've got other demands on agriculture. We've got other expectations from society. Expectations to reduce the emissions and protect the environment. Expectations to produce crops that are better for human nutrition, better for human health. We've got big objectives for improving soil health in the long term, and then also recovery and recycling. Then we've identified 6 different actions that can take place, and I'm not going to go into them today. I don't have time for all that. But I want to talk to you a little bit of how we see 4R fitting into the center of that. 4R is focused on the nutrients you apply. Fertilizers are a big part of it. Manure can be part of it as well. But the source, rate, time, and place, that describes a nutrient application. Plant nutrition is about more than that, because even every time you do tillage on your field, you're influencing the nutrient flows through your soils as well. And so we recognize that it has to be integrated with farm management, and all of that is part of responsible plant nutrition as well. And that together, the way we apply nutrients and the way we manage our soils and the way we manage our farms, all of those impact a huge number of indicators that relate to sustainability, economic, environmental, and social aspects of sustainability. And you can define a whole bunch of different indicators, things you could measure. The trouble is, a lot of the ones that are environmental and social are very difficult to measure on the farm. The one you can measure well is nutrient use efficiency, and it's often correlated to a lot of the other effects as well. So that's where we're placing this. The 4 R's are very important because of the fact that they're relevant to all of the aims and actions of responsible plant nutrition. They're connected to the performance outcomes, but the practices themselves are site-specific. I haven't had my boots on the ground in Manitoba to tell you what the practices need to be here, but I hopefully will point you in the direction of using indicators to identify them. And then I want to also point out that it's recognized. 4 our nutrient stewardship principles are recognized by the United Nations and the Food and Agriculture Organization in their code of conduct for responsible management and use of fertilizers. There's many ways we can define nutrient use efficiency. And this diagram here, it's not intended to show you that corn might have a taproot someday. Corn doesn't have a taproot, but what we're trying to show here is on the right-hand side here, we've got a bunch of inputs, nutrient inputs. In most cases, we're often talking about nitrogen. And when we look at fertilizer, we look very closely at, when we apply fertilizer to the soil, how much does the plant take up? And we've designated the uptake as U, and that's everything we can measure that the plant has taken up, which is usually conveniently cut off at the ground level because scientists recognize that it's an awful lot of work to figure out what the plant is taking up into their roots. But the amount of nutrient that gets into the plant in response to the fertilizer addition, that's the best measure of fertilizer recovery or fertilizer use efficiency. Very difficult to do on the farm, though. And so when we often recommend as a really thorough measure of nutrient use efficiency for the farm or for your crop fields or crop systems is a partial nutrient balance, where you're looking at R, which is removal, over the whole set of inputs that you can measure or estimate with some degree of reliability. Fertilizer plus manure plus biological fixation plus deposition from the atmosphere plus whatever is in the irrigation water as well, if that's relevant. There's a number of other indicators as well. Agronomic efficiency is the yield response per unit of fertilizer added. Partial factor productivity is just yield over fertilizer, which is easy to calculate, useful to look at, but is subject to a few problems because of the fact that, it doesn't tell you whether you really needed the fertilizer or not. And then nutrient concentration, we propose that as an efficiency indicator as well, because when it comes to people who use the products of agriculture, it gives you the amount of nutrient, that particular nutrient supplied per unit of the crop consumed. And then nutrient harvest index, the removal as a function of uptake, can be important as well in a number of ways. We've grouped these then into fertilizer, crop, and system indicators. The one we call the most important indicator for most crop producers is partial nutrient balance ratio, and that is the most common form of nutrient use efficiency. You can also look at it as a difference, the amount of input, the amount of output subtracted from those inputs, and that gives you a surplus, and I'll say more about that later. You can also look at nutrient use efficiency at the farm gate, and this is a better application for farms that integrate livestock as well. And you can just assess the amount of nutrients in everything you purchased and bring onto the farm, and the nutrients in whatever you're selling from the farm. And that can be a useful indicator as well. So how do these relate? We've got 5 different names of responsible plant nutrition that I showed earlier. When we look at improving productivity and efficiency on the farm particularly, number 1, on farm, looking at your partial factor productivity and your partial nutrient balance, the yield per unit of fertilizer used, or the amount of nitrogen in or nutrient in that yield, then you're assessing the efficacy of your practices on farm. If you're developing new technologies in a research context, you want to be using something like agronomic efficiency or recovery efficiency, where you're looking at how much did those did yield increase or nutrient uptake increase in response to the fertilizer being added. That's more costly to do, and that's why it's done in the research context. Number 2, when you're looking at increasing nutrient recovery and recycling from waste, one of the big ones for agriculture, of course, is manures. And a farm gate balance can tell you whether your farm is accumulating nutrients or whether nutrients are being depleted in one sense. So it gives you an opportunity to it basically indicates the opportunity for you to do something to recover nutrients better or make better use of nutrients. If you're making products from manure that can be transported, for example, there are those who are working on extracting struvite from manure. And if you take a product like struvite and then it differs in its solubility compared to other fertilizers, so you'd need to assess its agronomic efficiency and recovery efficiency if you're developing a product like that from wastes, and similarly from municipal water treatment wastes and those sorts of things. So there's some useful efficiency indicators for that objective. And then lifting and sustaining soil health and soil carbon, partial nutrient balance becomes important as well. And here's where we recognize, and a lot of John's slides were showing the same thing as well. You can be extremely efficient in a one-year situation, but if you start depleting the soil, you will not be efficient in future years and you will lose yield potential. And so a partial nutrient balance actually has an optimum rather than a maximum. Nutrient use efficiency is generally not something you want to maximize. It's usually something you want to optimize. Number 4, when you're looking at enhancing human health, it's nutrient concentration, possibly nutrient harvest index as well. But the thing is here, a lot of things we do to increase nutrient use efficiency might actually decrease the concentration of nutrient in grain. Breeding for corn, for example, across North America has led to us growing corn that's far more nitrogen use efficient, but is somewhat lower in protein than it used to be in the past. And then finally, minimizing losses. Again, the partial nutrient balance indicator is the predominant one there, the one that's most frequently used and is most useful, and it is an indicator of potential for nutrient losses. So I'm going to go into a little bit more detail here on some examples where you can see how nutrient use efficiency is put into action. If we look at number 1 here, these are some data from a publication in Nature Scientific Reports, fairly recent, and it's from a lot of Manitoba research is in there. Alan Moulin and his group are behind this one. What they've looked at here is the yield and net revenue in response to nitrogen rates within management zones that have been defined within fields at various sites. So the management zones, the blue lines indicated management zones that are defined by low yields in the past, and then the medium yielding zone and a high yielding zone within each of these different sites. And then nitrogen rates were applied, going from 0, 50%, 100%, and 150% of recommended. And you can see, number 1, huge variability among sites. Some sites are responsive, some are not. We have a long way to go in predicting variability from year to year and from site to site as to what the optimum rate is. But it also identified that within fields you have manageable variability in optimum nitrogen rates, and sometimes surprising. On the upper left, for example, Manitoba #1 in 2014, what you see there is the high-yielding site actually didn't require the most nitrogen. With just 50% of nitrogen, it had a huge response to nitrogen to yield, and the medium yielding zone of the field actually required, medium and low, required more nitrogen to get to their optimum levels of yield and to essentially maximize net revenue. I won't go into detail on all those sites. This is meant to be an example showing work that identifies opportunity, an opportunity that could increase revenue by $11 to $26 per acre if we could manage the variability we're identifying there. The paper itself promises future papers in which some of that is predicted more thoroughly. When we deal with the partial nutrient balance approach, international experts in Europe particularly, since 2015, have been encouraging us to look at nutrient use efficiency this way. You plot your outputs on the y-axis on the left here, and then on the bottom your nutrient inputs. And this is done for nitrogen, for this example. And what I've done here is taken the FAO data for all of North America, the US and Canada. And what we're looking at here in terms of nitrogen yield is the nitrogen in all harvested crops. Now, FAO crops do not include hay, but they include pretty well everything that's harvested as grain or fruit or things like that. And then looking at the nitrogen inputs, those inputs included fertilizer, applied manure, biological fixation, and atmospheric deposition. So you can see the numbers worldwide have not been that high. We plot it on there, and then the efficiency becomes the slope of the line from any point on that in that space. The line from the point to the origin, the 0, 0, is the nutrient use efficiency. So, and then there are two critical nutrient use efficiencies defined, the 70% and the 90%. And it's suggested that for many situations, you don't want to be above 90% because you risk mining from the soil. And you would like to be above 70% to say that you're using the nutrients that are input efficiently. There's also this concept that we need to avoid an absolute loss per hectare. And that's based on the concept of planetary boundaries. Difficult concept, but something that's widely quoted by many environmental organizations and is something that does relate to the public. The planetary boundary that has been defined for North America in a recent paper equates to about 35 kilograms per hectare. So that's shown by that red line. So then what we've got here is a definition of a safe operating space. The interesting thing is here I've done it on a continental scale. You can take your inputs on your farm and your outputs on your farm, and you can plot yourself as to where you fit on this curve. And to me, you know, the idea is, just as in the past, there were maximum yield clubs, and they eventually transformed into something more useful, which is the maximum economic yield clubs, and lends itself to what John Hurd was talking about again, maximizing your return in terms of economics. I would propose that, you know, an excellent initiative for farmers that are interested in working together to improve our public perception is to develop nutrient use efficiency clubs that essentially use this approach, saying how much can we increase our nitrogen yields and still stay in the safe operating space. You may need some outside advice on to how to find the the boundaries of that safe operating space. I'm not suggesting here that 70%, 90%, and 35 kilograms per hectare applies everywhere and to everyone, but this would be the idea. Those colored dots, by the way, represent different eras. And in North America, you can see back in the early 60s, yields were lower, efficiency was about the same, and then we got less efficient. How did we get less efficient? Well, there was the era of the 70s and 80s where we poured on fertilizer a little bit more. And then through breeding and better management, we're starting to tend towards improvement. And there was one year that was in the safe operating space back in the past decade, and the last 3 years are just on the border of that. So that's an approach that can be used. It can scale from your farm level all the way to the global level, and I think that's a tool that we could be using in agriculture as well. A little bit more specifics on Manitoba. And first I wanted to look at, where are our outputs going in terms of crop production. And I take these numbers from basically Stats Canada production numbers. What we've got here is nitrogen removal in kilotons, 1,000 tons essentially, from the whole province of Manitoba, and what crops it's coming from. Traditionally it was wheat and barley, or wheat and other grains, and then forages played a big role. You can see the trends over time. Number one, soybeans made a big dent in nitrogen removal when they were introduced. Corn has much lower nitrogen removal. Wheat has stayed roughly the same. And canola, of course, has emerged as a crop that's really taking up a lot of the nitrogen from the soil. And forages have diminished. Another thing to take from this graph as well is that the year-to-year variability. We're still very climate dependent, and so when you're looking at nutrient use efficiency or nutrient outputs, so much of it is still governed by the weather. When we look at this in the context of the inputs that have been supplied, that rising demand for nitrogen by the crops, it's been met by increasing fertilizer use primarily. In the province of Manitoba, fertilizer is probably more than 80% of your total inputs. And what we've got here, I've plotted it since 1960. Crop removal is the orange line. Fertilizer is the blue. The green represents nitrogen fixation by either hay crops or soybeans or the pulses. And the brown is manure, divided into two categories. Manure actually applied to the soil, and manure as excreted by animals is the sum total of those two. The NR stands for not recovered. And that's only a crude estimate. I think it's worthwhile to always be aware of how much nitrogen is being excreted by animals in the province. It's an opportunity to better recover it. I don't think we have the technologies yet. A lot of it is lost as ammonia, but it should be part of the agricultural nutrient budget. It can be argued that it's not part of the cropland budget because it isn't actually applied to cropland. So if we look at this, what we see here, we've got increasing crop removal, but inputs are actually increasing faster. So we've got declining nutrient use efficiency as a generality over time. But we have continuing increasing trends. We wouldn't say that nutrient use efficiency is plummeting, but it is worthy of paying attention to. And the interesting thing here for phosphorus, a nutrient that's more stable in the soil, is it's extremely similar. In this province of Manitoba, the sufficiency approach is really showing here. The build-up approach, John was telling me that in 2020, around that era, with soybeans coming into the province and corn coming in as well, and more canola, growers are paying more attention to building the phosphorus levels in their soil, and so we had a number of years of surplus phosphorus applications. Anyway, so there's some usefulness of the partial nutrient balance indicator. When I look at indicators like for increasing the recovery and recycling from waste, a couple of the things to mention here. Struvite, processed manure, nutrients recovered from food waste. There are opportunities there to exploit, and some of those products need to be evaluated for their availability to the crop. Trouble is, evaluating that efficiency is very difficult to do on farm. Just two rates, just applying one plot width and one plot without is not enough. You really have to compare them at a number of rates before you can demonstrate that a product has greater efficiency than another product. Here I'm comparing product A with product B, and it demonstrates a recovery efficiency improvement from 66% to 77% when you go to product B. But it took, if you look at all of those dots representing a field plot of research, that's a lot of, it's a big task to collect that much data. Then lifting and sustaining soil health. I think the important thing to remember here is nitrogen is very keenly tied to soil organic matter. Some of the early days in which nutrient use efficiency was very high on the prairies in the 60s was due to the fact of a lot of summer fallow and a lot of soil organic matter being mineralized, depleted, and releasing its nitrogen. Whereas if you go into the opposite situation where you're using no-till, annual cropping, perhaps even cover cropping to build soils, you actually need the nitrogen input. This is an example from Kentucky. Not anything like Manitoba conditions, not anything like Ontario conditions, but in Kentucky, in a continuous cornfield that was grown with and without a rye cover crop. They collected this data over 39 years, the profile soil organic carbon, and they managed with high rates of nitrogen, combined with no-till, combined with that cover crop of rye that was plowed back that was left in the soil or plowed back. You could build the soil back to the levels that you find in today's sod. 150 pounds of nitrogen was enough to optimize the yield of corn, but it was not enough to optimize the carbon contribution from the rotation that included corn plus the cover crop rye. That's just one example. You don't find many of them in the literature, but it does indicate to you that if you're going to increase the carbon input into the soil and want to build soil organic matter, you need the nitrogen input as well, and that's something to be taken into account when you're assessing your nutrient use efficiency indicator. Then we get to nutrient concentration, and here are things like zinc, for example. And this example is with corn. There has been some research done in the prairies with zinc, but a lot of research in North America done on cereal crops is just looking for the yield response. If you look in the health literature, a lot of people say that a good proportion of the population here in North America as well is deficient in zinc in their diet. So we really need some more research on how zinc additions might be able to improve not only the total amount, but also the bioavailability of zinc in prairie-grown wheat, for example. Now I'm going to get to aim number 5, where we minimize losses such as greenhouse gases, minimize pollution of the air with ammonia, of the water with nitrate, and then impacts on biodiversity as well. This scientific panel has, over the past 5 years, produced a number of issue briefs, and the two I highlight here is the most recent one is on mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, but earlier we had one as well illustrating the impact of responsible plant nutrition and the 4 Rs on biodiversity. There's strong international pressure to cut nutrient losses. The biodiversity conference that was held a few years back in Montreal, and just in the past year, a new assessment of global nitrous oxide emissions has been released. There's going to be continuing attention on this, and the fertilizer industry has been paying attention to it. In 22, IFA produced a report called Reducing Emissions from Fertilizer Use, and basically assessing what the baseline was of emissions associated with just the use of fertilizer, not the manufacturing of it. And their analysis proposed that increasing the global nutrient use efficiency from about 50% where it is today, it's actually increased since then already, we know it's up around 55%, but if we increased it to 70%, we'd reduce those emissions by 320 million tons of CO2 equivalents. That's by possibly 30–40%, and then we could further reduce it through the use of inhibitors as well, for a total potential reduction of 70%. There are initiatives involving Canadian scientists as well to gain recognition for reduced emissions from agriculture. The most recent is called CanN2O Net. If you've seen in the Western Producer, there was an article featuring the tall tower that's to be set up in Yorktown, measuring nitrous oxide on the scale of a few hundred square kilometers rather than just a single field. And that project also involves more flux towers, more chamber measurements, and a lot of other aspects of initiatives to reduce nitrous oxide emission from farms in Canada. Canadian scientists are also involved in a global nitrogen innovation center for clean energy and the environment. And that one, the main base is in Maryland in the States, but they're really focused on is a use of what they call green ammonia as an energy source to replace fossil fuels. And the intent of a lot of these initiatives is to improve what we're doing in the National Inventory Report, where Canadian scientists have made contributions in the past to recognize soil organic matter storage in agriculture. But what we need is better recognition of on-farm practices that reduce the emissions of nitrous oxide. Here I'm trying to illustrate where the nitrous oxide emissions occur in the whole nutrient flow in the field. And there's really two critical control points what you can manipulate with inhibitors. Either urease inhibitors, UI or CRF, for controlled release fertilizers, will slow the release of or the dissolution of the urea to actually slow down or cut the emission of ammonia, NH3, some of which becomes an indirect source of nitrous oxide. The one that has the biggest effect, the biggest control, is the nitrification inhibitor, which affects the oxidation of ammonia into nitrate. And that one has a very large impact on nitrous oxide. If we look at the global level, in fact, I'll have some numbers on that. This figure illustrates it more clearly as well, that you need to use the right inhibitor for the situation involved. If your urea is being applied in a manner, either left on the soil surface or concentrated at too high a rate in a band, you're susceptible to losing ammonia. And in those instances, a urease inhibitor or a controlled release fertilizer can be useful. If your fertilizer is anhydrous ammonia, for example, all you need is a nitrification inhibitor. With urea, often both inhibitors are useful and give the most reliable control of nitrogen losses. What I'm trying to show here is a summary of a good number of global meta-analyses. These are analyses that take into account hundreds and hundreds of site years of measurements. And what we attempted to assemble here was our best estimate of how the different 4R practices compare. And there's no doubt that the source practices, the enhanced efficiency fertilizers, have some of the largest effects. You can cut your fertilizer rates and reduce nitrous oxide emissions by about 9%, but you may also be reducing yield by 4%. And timing, very little effect on nitrous oxide emissions, quite a bit of effect on reducing ammonia emissions, and not much effect on yield. Perhaps a positive one, though. Placement can be effective in reducing both nitrous oxide and very effective in reducing ammonia losses. Small effect again on yield. When we get to the enhanced efficiency sources, we've got an environmental benefit that is larger than the yield benefit. And so that's very important to keep in mind, because if you're a farmer and you're paying money for these inhibitors, the return on that investment is really going to society. You're cutting your nitrous oxide losses a lot more than you're improving your own profits. As we move into what we call the net zero future, if you look at what the energy industry is proposing in terms of substitutes for fossil fuels, and if we look at the way the industry is going in proposing to produce green ammonia to replace fossil fuels, the production methods have to be clean. They have to produce the ammonia without releasing CO2 into the air. So the traditional Haber-Bosch process used at the Coke plant here in town, they use the CO2 they emit, capture that CO2 and put it into urea. But if we have production methods for nitrogen fertilizers that don't emit CO2, it's going to be a lot harder to make urea as a fertilizer. So the question arises then, what's going to be the replacement for urea? In the prairies here, you still use a large amount of anhydrous ammonia. The rest of the world relies very much on urea. There are substitutes like ammonium nitrate, but the danger in handling that is too much. There are substitutes like calcium nitrate, but it's a pretty low analysis fertilizer, even if it's a good fertilizer. And then there's ammonium sulfate, and it has pluses and minuses as well. But basically what this report is concluding, that if all ammonia were produced either via electrolysis or methane pyrolysis, which the energy industry is proposing, neither route would generate CO2 for use in urea production. You also have to keep in mind when you're using urea, the urea molecule includes an atom of carbon, and that atom of carbon is eventually released as CO2 as well. So there's an emission coefficient that would be assigned to urea of 1.6 tons per ton of nitrogen. The fertilizer industry gets credit for trapping that CO2 in its fertilizer products, but it's essentially a transfer of the greenhouse gas emission from the industry to the farm level. Fortunately, nobody's penalizing you for it yet. So this is just to show the trends in nitrogen fertilizer forms used, and pointing out that 52% of the nitrogen that goes down in the prairies is still currently urea. So this is an important question for the future. I'm going to talk a little bit about another approach that recognizes an important feature that is a shortcoming in our national inventory as well. And that's the proposal to use nitrogen surplus as a much stronger indicator of farm performance. And what this, the strength here is that you can measure a nitrogen surplus on a farm quite easily. It's simply nitrogen applied minus nitrogen removed. It relates to every loss pathway for nitrogen. The more you shrink that nitrogen surplus, it's going to reduce nitrous oxide emission, ammonia emission, NOx emission, and nitrate leaching all at the same time. Using an approach like this doesn't restrict you to a certain amount of nitrogen input. As long as you manage your crops to take up that nitrogen, it gives you that flexibility. And it also includes the upstream emissions from manufacturing whatever you're applying as well. The limitations, it does neglect the inhibitor effects for nitrous oxide and neglects the source effects like urea. And it also somewhat neglects trade-offs with soil carbon, but that could be managed. Our industry position has been that 4R, nitrogen surplus is a good indicator, but you need 4R practices as well to enable the full, thorough prediction of the benefit of management practices. And what I thought I'd point out this curve that is used in the publication that supports this nitrogen surplus concept. And here what you've got on the x-axis on the bottom is the nitrogen surplus and a generalized relationship across 286 sites, different crops, all across North America. It was based mostly on corn, but it does include wheat and canola and a few other things as well. And so I extrapolated this curve to some data that we have on Canadian canola production. And our data suggests that, I don't know if this was 1 year or a multi-year average, but 42 bushels per acre average canola yield and an average nitrogen application rate that is somewhere in between 130 and 175 pounds per acre, putting canola's nitrogen use efficiency at somewhere between 48% and 65%. You can see that if we improved the efficiency, reduced the surplus, we would reduce emissions, but by a smaller amount than an equal move in the other direction. So, and this is real data on measured nitrous oxide emissions, and it recognizes the fact that it's not a constant amount of the nitrogen that you apply that is related to nitrous oxide emissions. It's not a linear relationship. It starts to go up quite sharply when you're applying more than is being removed. So the thing is we really need to be recognizing in the Canadian inventory that it's not a linear relationship, and that farms that are managing to have a fairly tight nitrogen use efficiency are contributing less to the problem than all the others. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the programs that Fertilizer Canada has across Canada as well for our designation and certification. The thing is here that if we are going to be convincing to the public, we need to have a third party speaking on our behalf. And so one idea is setting up for our certified individuals so that you as a farmer can have somebody attesting to what you're doing in terms of your practices. There was a goal at one point of 15 million acres by 25. They're being careful with that goal because Canada has also passed a law about greenwashing, so we have to make sure we can vet and document everything we're saying about 4R practices here. When we look at how the current inventory works, it's based on regulatory reporting of fertilizer shipments to agricultural markets. And some of the data that I was showing you earlier about fertilizer use in Manitoba is based on that data as well. The census collects some information on fertilizer and lime, and then the industry has a fertilizer use survey as well. And it's producing us lots of information, but it's all self-reported information. So this will give us a little bit of a picture of sustainable and responsible nutrient management in Canada, and gives a whole lot of detail. I'll just pick out a few things, and this is for canola in Western Canada in 23. The numbers that we get from this survey are suggesting that about 20% of the nitrogen volume that goes down is treated with some form of an enhanced efficiency fertilizer, either a controlled release fertilizer or a double inhibitor or a nitrification inhibitor or a urease inhibitor on their own. And it's broken down by fall, spring, and before plant and at plant, and I'm not going to go into the detail there. When we look at canola's fertilizer nitrogen use footprint, which is, pounds per bushel of canola, which I see is very commonly used for many crops across North America. It's not truly an efficiency, it's a footprint, but they're reciprocal. Basically, an efficiency is always output over input, and it's bushels per pound, but this is pounds per bushel. You can take a heart that Manitoba is a little bit ahead of Saskatchewan here, in that we require less fertilizer per bushel of canola produced. And here we're looking at spring wheat, a similar trend. You get more bushels of wheat per pound of nitrogen than you do canola, but of course the value is smaller and the protein content is less. So, and then details on 4R practices as well. And a lot of growers do say they believe that their practices meet 4R requirements, but only about 18% have a formal 4R plan in place. Now, there's work that needs to be done, and I think we need grower input as well from grower organizations to define what needs to be in a 4R plan and ensure that we have that we get greater participation in plans that document the practices in place, so that we have the credibility we need to say that we're managing nutrients responsibly. So summing up, nutrient use efficiency serves as an important indicator of the performance of our 4R practices. Specific forms are useful for very specific purposes within responsible plant nutrition. Enhanced efficiency fertilizers can reduce nutrient losses and improve efficiency and profitability of fertilizer use, and are particularly important for nitrous oxide emissions. Some of them have a very strong effect on nitrous oxide emissions, and that's particularly the nitrification inhibitors. And by gaining recognition for your 4R practices, it depends on tracking both the practices that you're using and the outcomes. You can find these issue briefs that I've been talking about at the URL here, sprpn.org. I'm hoping I have a minute or two yet, Amir, for questions. Yep. Thank you.
Any question? Yeah, can you please?
But some of the European countries haven't reduced or limited the amount of fertilizer that can be applied or farms can buy. Did that, or is it might be too short of a time frame yet, but does that have an impact on the efficiency?
So your question is, in Europe, has it had an impact on the efficiency? I would say the numbers suggest that in the aggregate efficiency, it has improved. There have been examples where there have been step backs from that. For example, in Denmark, where the protein content of the wheat went down below consumer expectations, and so some of the regulations were amended to allow for higher rates of application again. But the context is as well that in Europe, application rates relative to yield were higher, particularly if you look at the 1980s, 1990s, compared to North America. So they improved their efficiency, but they were less efficient to begin with. Yep.
Any other question?
Good morning, Tom. It's Edgar with Western Ag.
Hello, Edgar.
Appreciate the presentation. Through into the 80s, Saskatchewan, Western Manitoba, they changed their farming practices to doing zero-till, and my perception on nitrogen use efficiency through that window was that we went down. But from that is because we were actually needing to build the soil organic matter. Now we're 20, some areas 30 years into zero-till. We are seeing greater nitrogen mineralization potential from that. And so farmers who are recognizing that mineralization are dialing in their fertility closer. But can you, that's just my perspective for the data that I see, can you dial in a little bit? You had some national numbers there, but can you make more comments about Western Canada and from a bigger perspective, how the nitrogen efficiency may have been improving on land that has had higher years or longer duration of zero-till?
Okay, thanks for the question, Edgar. It's a good one. What you're suggesting is that, the decline in nitrogen use efficiency associated with the transition to no-till is justified because that nitrogen is actually going into the soil to help build the soil organic matter. But then that after time, we should be seeing an improvement again in nutrient use efficiency as some of that nitrogen stored in the soil becomes a source for the following crops. I don't think that any of the data that I presented is sufficiently precise to pull that out. But I would venture to say that if individual farms that have been tracking both their nitrogen use and yields of every crop for every field over a period of 30 years, they may be able to demonstrate that. And I think that's where we as an industry need to step forward and challenge ourselves to find ways to collect our own data, ensure that it's verifiable, and then present that to society. That is the strongest and best way to avoid having government regulations come in and limit the amount that you can apply. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Tom.